You know what nobody talks about. The quiet that comes after. Not the dramatic moment of walking away. Not the argument that finally went too far. Not the message that was sent and never replied to. But the morning after all of that, when you wake up and the house is still. And for the first time in as long as you can remember, you can actually breathe, and then immediately, almost without pause, the guilt arrives. Because you were taught from the very beginning that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that no matter what happens you do not walk away from the people who raised you, and yet here you are, and the strangest, most confusing part of all of it is this: you do not regret it, and that absence of regret scares you more than anything else. Psychologists have spent decades studying family estrangement, the deliberate choice to reduce or completely end contact with one or more family members. And what the research consistently reveals challenges almost everything our culture tells us about this decision. Dr. Carl Pillemer of Cornell University conducted one of the largest studies on family estrangement ever undertaken, interviewing over 1,300 adults who had experienced significant family separation. What he found was not what most people expect. The overwhelming majority of people who chose to distance themselves from family did not do so impulsively. They did not do so out of selfishness. They did so after years, sometimes decades, of trying every available alternative first. Take a moment to let that land. This was not abandonment. This was not giving up. This was survival, arrived at slowly, painfully, and only after everything else had already been tried. For most people, this decision does not arrive suddenly. It builds slowly, quietly, over years of moments that individually seem small, but collectively become impossible to carry. Maybe it was a family where love always came with conditions, where approval was something you had to earn repeatedly and could lose without warning, where your achievements were minimized, your pain was dismissed, and your boundaries were treated as personal attacks rather than reasonable requests. Maybe it was more specific than that. A parent whose unpredictable anger made the entire house hold its breath, a sibling whose cruelty was always excused, a family system that required you to stay small, stay silent, and keep performing a version of yourself that had nothing to do with who you actually were. Psychiatrist Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose landmark research transformed how psychologists understand the long-term effects of chronic emotional stress, found something critically important. The nervous system does not distinguish between physical threat and emotional threat. A household where love is unpredictable, where criticism is constant, and where the child never feels fundamentally safe registers in the body as ongoing stress. Not always dramatically, not always visibly, but deeply, persistently, and cumulatively over time. The decision to choose peace is not made in a single moment of anger. It is made by a nervous system that has finally reached the absolute end of what it can absorb. And here is something worth understanding before we go deeper, because what happens inside the brain at this moment is far more remarkable than most people realize. When a person finally makes the decision to create distance from a chronically painful family dynamic, they are overriding one of the most powerful neurological forces in the human brain. Attachment to family, to the people who raised us, is not simply emotional, it is biological. It is ancient, and it runs deeper in the nervous system than almost any other human drive. Researcher Dr. Sue Johnson, whose work on emotionally focused therapy and adult attachment has influenced a generation of therapists and researchers, showed that the pull to maintain connection with our earliest attachment figures does not simply fade because the relationship became painful. The brain continues reaching for that connection long after the conscious mind has recognized it as harmful. The heart and the mind are genuinely in conflict, and that conflict is exhausting in ways that are almost impossible to explain to someone who has never experienced it. Which means that when someone finally chooses peace over family, when they make the decision to step back from that attachment, despite everything their nervous system is pulling them toward, they are not being cold, they are not being selfish. They are making one of the most neurologically difficult decisions a human being can make, and they are making it because staying had finally become more damaging than leaving. Now pause here for a moment, because this is the part that matters most and gets spoken about the least: the guilt. Because nobody prepares you for how persistent it is, how it shows up not just in the big moments, the holidays, the birthdays, the family gatherings you are no longer part of, but in the smallest, most ordinary ones. A song that plays in a grocery store, a smell that takes you somewhere you thought you had left, a moment of genuine happiness with nobody from your past to share it with. Psychologist Dr. Joshua Coleman, who has devoted his career specifically to studying family estrangement, describes this guilt as one of the most misunderstood emotional experiences there is. It is not simple, it is not clean, and critically, it does not mean the decision was wrong. He makes a distinction that deserves to be heard clearly. There is a difference between guilt that is telling you something true, that you have genuinely caused harm and need to repair it, and guilt that is simply the echo of a system that taught you from childhood that your needs did not matter, that putting yourself first was selfish, that choosing your own peace was a betrayal of the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally but never quite managed it. Most people who chose peace over family are not carrying the first kind of guilt, they are carrying the second, and learning to tell the difference, really tell the difference, is one of the most important and most difficult parts of the entire healing process. And underneath the guilt, there is something even heavier, something that takes longer to reach and far longer to name. Grief. Not the grief of losing someone who was consistently good to you, but the specific and devastating grief of losing the family you needed and were never given. Psychologist Pauline Boss, who developed the concept of ambiguous loss, described this as one of the most difficult forms of loss to process because it exists without social recognition or ritual. Nobody sends flowers when you grieve a living parent who never truly saw you. Nobody acknowledges the loss of a sibling relationship that was always more painful than it was loving. There is no funeral for the family you deserved and were never given, no casserole on the doorstep, no socially acceptable mourning period, no one asking how you are holding up. And so the grief gets carried quietly, privately, often for years, alongside the peace that the distance finally brought. Both things true at the same time. The relief real, the sadness real, the freedom real, the loss real, all of it living inside the same person simultaneously. And all of it valid, every single part. What makes this particular grief so heavy is not just what was lost, it is what was never there to begin with. The version of the relationship that should have existed, the parent who should have been safe, the home that should have felt like rest. Grieving something that never fully existed is one of the loneliest and most disorienting experiences a person can carry quietly through a life. Here is what the research ultimately says about people who make this choice, and it deserves to be said clearly and without qualification. Choosing peace over family is not what weak people do. It is not what selfish people do. It is not what people do when they have given up too easily or loved too little. People who reach this decision have almost always spent years, sometimes their entire adult lives, putting everyone else's comfort above their own. They have absorbed, accommodated, minimized, excused, and forgiven more than most people will ever be asked to. They have returned to painful dynamics repeatedly, not because they were naive, but because they loved genuinely and hoped persistently. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina, whose decades of research on post-traumatic growth fundamentally changed how the field understands human resilience, found something important. The people who demonstrate the deepest capacity for growth and self-understanding are not the ones who avoided the hardest decisions. They are the ones who made them, who sat inside the discomfort of going against everything they were taught and chose their own well-being anyway. The decision to choose peace is not the beginning of their selfishness, it is the end of their self-abandonment, and that distinction changes everything. So if you are someone who has chosen peace over family, or who is standing quietly at the edge of that decision right now, here is what matters most. You are not a bad person. You are not a failure. You are not someone who gave up too easily, or walked away before you should have. You are someone who finally took seriously what your mind and body had been trying to tell you for a very long time. That you deserved safety, that you deserved consistency, that love, real love, does not require you to disappear in order to receive it. Dr. Edith Eger, a Holocaust survivor and psychologist whose work on psychological freedom has moved millions, wrote something that cuts directly to the heart of this experience. She observed that the most important liberation is not freedom from external circumstances. It is freedom from the internal prison built from guilt, obligation, and the deeply conditioned belief that your suffering is simply the price of belonging. Choosing peace is not giving up on family. It is finally giving yourself permission to belong somewhere that does not cost you everything to stay. You did not choose this easily. You did not choose it without pain. You did not choose it without love. You chose it because you finally decided that your life, quiet, peaceful, and entirely your own, was worth choosing.